Yes, planning and displacement are constant themes that I've covered over many years. Um, I, in addition to having worked as a professional planner with the city planning department in New York City, uh, in with the state of Massachusetts, and around the world, I taught at CUNY. I taught urban planning and policy, and at the Graduate Center. I'm now retired. And let me just make a few general, broad statements, and then maybe we can enter a conversation. So I can also hear a little bit more from you, the kind of detailed questions that you might have that I might be able to respond to. So on zoning, um, we have to look at ourselves in New York City because New York City is the only major city in the United States that has never had a comprehensive long-term plan. Instead, it has used zoning as what it claims to be an instrument for long-term planning. Well, zoning began as a means of regulating development. And it really got its big start in the early part of the 20th century. New York's first zoning code was written and approved in 1916, but it was after a big debate about planning versus zoning. And it turns out that zoning won. Why? Because it really was a convenient tool for developers. And it was opposed by the big downtown interests at that time in Lower Manhattan, who wanted to expand and who were anxious to move out the immigrant neighborhoods that were encroaching on Lower Fifth Avenue. Zoning was a good tool because you could change the regulations to allow for qualitatively more new development in those surrounding neighborhoods that would jack up property values and make low-income housing no longer reasonable option for investors in land and in housing. And so zoning became a tool right from the start in New York City to displace affordable housing. And it's been used that way throughout its history. It's done many other things as well, but that has been a consistent thing. And that's the reason why the real estate industry really latches on to zoning, in addition to the fact that zoning has become such a major complex animal that you really have to have a high-paid lawyer and lobbyists to pick it apart so that you can use it in your favor to encourage new development or to prevent development that you don't find to be appropriate for your properties. So, uh, so the other general thing I want to say is zoning is by itself neither good nor bad. It can be used in a whole slew of different ways. And the unfortunate thing in New York City is that it's the only tool the city has been using for planning. The Department of City Planning is really a department of zoning. And it's, as I said, it's the only major city that's never actually done any planning. Now, we've had in the last 20, 30 years, as many policy analysts, many neighborhoods have asked for planning, have demanded planning. We've had strategic plans. We've had Michael Bloomberg introduced a long-term sustainability plan, which was approved as an official plan and quickly forgotten. So even when the city talks about planning, the political environment is such that it's not taken seriously. And the city planning department, which should be the advocate for comprehensive planning, actually opposes it. I'm sad to say 2 years ago, I participated in the charter revision hearing about planning and followed a panel that included the head of the city planning department, who was arguing against mandating long-term comprehensive planning in the city charter, the head of the planning department. And her argument was planning's a waste of time. It takes a long time, and it produces a document that sits on the shelf. And of course, there are many documents that have sat on the shelf. I'm not making any illusions because planning is not taken seriously. That's why they sit on the shelf. 197A plans, and let me sort of end with that. I've been my whole life and my whole career an advocate for community-based planning, because that's an element that is so sorely missing. I'm a trained professional planner, but the problem with too much professional planning is it's divorced from the real environments that people live and work in. And people who live and work in communities have unique knowledge and understanding and experience. They're not always right, but the professional planners aren't always right either. So community planning is essential. It's the element that's missing. In 1989, this New York City Charter was revised as a result of the push from neighborhoods and communities to make community-based plans as valuable as anything the city produced. And it came from the civil rights movement. If you trace it right back to its beginnings, in the 1960s and 70s, urban renewal was displacing Black and brown communities all over. And the demand was, we need to plan our own communities. Don't tell us that we live in slums and the slums have to be destroyed so that you can build your new city that we won't be present or have a place in. So community-based planning. And then in the 1980s, the environmental justice movement, which also came out of communities of color. The same thing. We want to be able to clean up our neighborhoods, get rid of the waste transfer stations, get rid of the noxious industries, get rid of all of the negative environmental elements that make living in our neighborhoods riskier and dangerous to our health. That was another push towards community-based planning. So in 1989, the city charter was revised. And I have to say I was around then and part of that, and happy to see that revision. And immediately after that charter revision, 1990, I was working then at the city planning department, and I was happy to see David Dinkins was elected mayor and supported community-based planning. And a number of communities went and did their own plans. Fast forward to the late 1990s, we started the task force campaign for community-based planning. There were community-based plans going on all over the city. And when I was still working with the city planning department, I was working on a number of community-based plans, mostly on my own, by the way, because the agency was still stuck in the old way of thinking that land use policy had to be determined by the experts. And our counter was always, well, there are experts living in the communities too. In fact, they know often as much or more than you know, and they need to be at the table. So we started the campaign for community-based plannings. I think there were 16 community boards around the city who were part of it. There were professional planners in it, community activists from environmental justice movements, and neighborhood activists. Bloomberg came into office and tried to smother it and eventually was able to do so. And it faded away. But the biggest problem came from within the Department of City Planning. The Williamsburg, Brooklyn community plan was 12 years in the making, and it finally was approved as a 197A plan. And it involved a very diverse set of community elements. The Jewish community, the Irish community, the Black and Brown communities, the Latino community were all involved in it. There was a tremendous amount of argument, and but there was some consensus, and they reached a consensus on a plan. And the one thing that they said that they wanted to do was plan for the old industrial waterfront, which had been by then, by the early 2000s, abandoned by industry. With the move of the port over to New Jersey and the decline of industry, they wanted, and they had incredible discussions, lengthy discussions, and this plan took over a decade. And they had arguments. But the one thing they agreed on is we don't want high-rise condos on the waterfront.
Well,
And that was in their plan. We want the waterfront to look like the rest of Williamsburg. Combination of small industry and housing, modest scale, 1 to 4 family homes and small apartment buildings. But we wanted to extend to the waterfront so that there'll also be public access to the waterfront. Well, city planning made it very difficult for the Williamsburg folks, but it finally was approved. And 2 years later, the city planning department came back with a rezoning proposal for Williamsburg and Greenpoint. And guess what the central element of that was? High-rise luxury housing on the waterfront. Exactly what the one thing the community did not want to see. And then they invented a hocus pocus with their industrial mixed use zoning. They invented this new mixed use zoning, which was really a backdoor residential rezoning that made it up to the landowner to decide whether it would be industry or housing. And so you had a lot of real estate developers moving into the mixed use areas, buying up the land, and guess what they chose? They chose new, expensive, high-rise housing over industrial development and business development. So they killed it. They killed the plan. Um, and uh, and so that's so I still believe in community-based planning, but now when people call me up and say, we're thinking about doing a community plan, a 197A plan, 197A for section 197A of the city charter, which had been changed in 1989. And I say, don't waste your time because, but I continue to be a deep believer in community-based planning. And to me, what it means is developing your own strategy for the future of your neighborhoods. It's a political instrument as much as it is a technical instrument. What do you want your neighborhood to look like in the short term, midterm, and long term future? And think about the long term because nobody else is thinking about long term. If you think the developers are thinking long term, they can recover their initial investments in 20 years, depending on the location, but um, they're not necessarily in it for the long haul. And and so it is important. And I've been continue to be an advocate for community boards. The first reaction I get from my colleagues in the city planning profession is, yeah, but community boards can be parochial, narrow. They don't have a broader vision of the public good. And that is a real poisonous um, set of, I think, prejudices that we have to overcome. And we have to we have to, I think, go after the elected officials and uh, make sure that that doesn't happen. That those kinds of prejudices and attitudes don't divert people from taking a real interest in the long-term future of the places where they live and work. And and community boards are not perfect, but they're grossly underfunded. And, you know, the charter change also included a requirement that every community board should have their own planner, a professional planner.
Yes.
Well, we know how City Hall got around that. They said, well, we have a city planning department and with borough offices, and the borough office can always provide planning assistance to community boards. Not good enough. That's not good enough. That's unacceptable. Every community board should have a professional planning, but they should also have citizen planners, resident planners, people who may not have a planning degree, but have deep knowledge about the neighborhood and who have ideas and thoughts about how it ought to change over the long term. And I guess the last thing I would say that's been part of this constant battle, um, when the charter had changed and 197A plans became acceptable, the city planning department developed the rules for 197A plans. I was there then and spoke against this. The rules pretty much value only the narrow understanding of land use, that is zoning. The city's narrow understanding of land use is zoning, because zoning is land use. Zoning is not land use. Um, and um, but they twisted the rules for developing 197A plans. So ultimately, they had to have a zoning output. So forget, you can talk about, oh, we need more school capacity, we need more open space, we need all these other things, but that's that that doesn't affect zoning. Zoning doesn't really can't change that. That's the Department of Education, that's the Department of Parks and Recreation, and therefore the 197A plan too often was solely focused on zoning and not focused on all of the things that need to go along with zoning changes. You're going to have new development. Okay, what about school seats? Where are the new school seats going to come from? Oh, talk to the Department of Education. No, no. These things need to be part of the planning process from the beginning to the end and over the long term. So anyway, these were the discussions and the arguments we've had over the many years about community-based planning, and we're still having them. There's more listening going on among some of the younger council people, and some of the elected officials. But at this point, most of the younger council people and elected officials don't even remember that there is such a thing as community planning. And they think planning begins and ends with the Department of City Planning and the City Planning Commission. So that's kind of my general intro. I can talk about a lot of other things. And the big thing that we're all concerned about is displacement. Because you can have the best plan in the world, but if you can't afford to stay in the community where you've grown up, where you have friends and you have relations, and what is it for? Who benefits from it? And so it is directly linked, and I think it's continues to be a major social justice, racial justice issue, because it's communities of color who were displaced from their original lands in other continents and brought here landless, without access to land, and now are being serially displaced. Serial displacement is the story of most immigrant communities, and particularly immigrant communities from the South, the global South. And that's why it's such an essential element that has to be linked to planning. An understanding that planning needs to be an instrument for preserving and developing and allowing people to stay when they want to stay in communities that they grew up in, that several generations have grown up in, and in which they have a stake. So, comments, questions?
I have a question, if I may. Ethel Ty is here.
Go ahead, Ethel.
Thank you. Ms. Agnotti, that was an eye-opener. We have these feelings, but you've confirmed some of our worst fears. Thank you. And I think we'll be able to take action much more confidently going forward, knowing that we you've been through it, and we're here to follow in your footsteps and pick up the good fight. My question to you is what do you think would be a good way to get our legislators to um, assign a localized, hyper-local area median income. So when they start lending money from HUD and every place else, there's money available for these developers, OPM, other people's money all the time. When they have to calculate uh, their efforts to address our housing, the paucity of housing that's affordable to people who live here now. How do we get them to calculate the area median income for the local area where they will be building? And if it's in Brooklyn, they're not including Southern Westchester or Eastern Long Island.
Mhm. Well, that's a big question. The area median income is established based on boundaries drawn by HUD, the federal agency. And I know many housing advocates have demanded a change. But it's gonna take more than just changing city policy. The city can and actually has moved a little bit in this direction towards favoring housing that's in the lower, 30% of AMI instead of 80% of AMI. So favoring the construction of affordable housing in the lower brackets. The city has the discretion to do that, but unfortunately, the city has followed an affordable housing policy, which is basically makes it affordable to developers and not to the tenants. You know, the developers want to be given enough goodies by the city, additional development rights, tax breaks, so that they can serve more people below 30-50% of the AMI. And now with MIH, mandatory inclusionary housing, it's become a routine. And however, that is not working because it's still based on solving the problem by getting market rate development on the theory that you need market rate development in order to get affordable housing. That is a bogus theory. We had public housing. We had public housing because there was a federal commitment to build low-income public housing for working people. And the capital was advanced. The money was advanced out of the budget. That's the way to provide for people who are making minimum wage and who can't afford to pay more. The city has to put its capital funds in the pot. And since the fiscal crisis in the 1970s, all the housing policy has been based on, the whole city's falling apart. We need private developers to come in and invest in our neighborhoods because they're all fleeing. They're going somewhere else. So we're going to give them tax benefits. We're going to give them zoning benefits and, accept their bottom line. And that hasn't worked. It's not produced decent, low-income housing for the people who need it the most. So we have to fight. That's a big policy battle that has to continue. And just jiggling the AMI hasn't really helped very much. It's brought some marginal gains, but it's not. We got to get back to housing is a human right. Housing, we need social housing. We need housing to be understood not as the 20% or 30% left over after the private development, but housing, everybody has a right to housing. Anyway.
Sarah, you have a question?
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I'm actually hearing an echo, so I think it's coming from whoever is unmuted. But yeah, I have a question because there are a lot of people in this area, Mr. Agnotti, who are interested in doing community planning, and you know, I'm also so I'm a member of the community board, but also a member of the Crown Heights Tenant Union, and it's
Good.
very, yeah, thank you. I mean, it's important because the displacement is real and it's violent and ugly. And so I guess what I'm wondering is, um, you know, I take to heart all of the things that you're saying about how, I mean, I feel like especially you know, in Southern Crown Heights, we've been able to see how DCP has not had as well, what you were talking about, how DCP has had this negative influence on you know, the what's imagined to be possible. And I was wondering, but you know, there is interest, and also our council member who has a staffer who's here on this call is interested in this community planning process. And I think there's a big appetite for things to be done differently. And maybe this is putting you on the spot, but do you have recommendations for how it could be possible to
Who's
have a community plan?
council member?
That's Crystal Hudson, and Chiose is a little bit further
North.
east, but he's also interested in this community because Atlantic Avenue touches both of their districts. And I'm just wondering if it's not putting you on the spot too much, if you have recommendations about how it could be possible to do community planning or have a process that doesn't end up getting co-opted or corrupted by.
Mhm.
And Tom, before you answer that question, I think that's something, you know, some knowledge that Sarah may not have. Are the communities that are represented by um, um, Councilwoman Hudson and Councilman Osei have both looked at 197A plans. One accepted it and one rejected it. So talk about the decision making about the community-based planning as represented by 197A and how that has been successful or unsuccessful in their process.
So you're saying they accepted the idea of doing one?
So Community Board 3, right, went through the whole process of doing a 197A, and ultimately they came to the conclusion that the 197A, i.e. the community-based planning, was used against them in that it was not implemented as they envisioned. And Community Board 8, having witnessed that, decided not to participate in a 197A plan, but work with the ICIC initiative, Inner City Initiative for Community or something like that. I can't quite remember that. And that was affiliated by Michael Porter coming out of Harvard University. So it's just very interesting. And Community Board 9, to my memory, I think I have a 20-year history on the board, has never engaged in a 197A plan, just so we can make sure that we look at the wide swath that we have overlapping communities. Lots of information that just came from the two of us. Sorry about that.
Okay. Well, yeah, I don't really know too much uh, about that history in your community boards, but um, uh, as I said before, um, you can community boards can do their own plans. The problem is, of course, that it takes time, it takes resources, um, and it takes political savvy. I don't say it takes professional planning expertise, although at some point you need to have some special expertise, but it takes people who are political organizers to organize people to think about the future, to strategize, and to say what you want. Um, if you do a 197A plan, you call up the city planning department and say, "Yeah, we're going to do 197A. Can you please sit in with us and help us?" And um, then you may not get anywhere. Uh, so actually, this was you may have heard this happen in Bushwick recently. Bushwick spent um, many years uh, talking about doing a community plan, uh, and then they decided themselves that what they wanted to do was a rezoning to deal with the development pressures that were resulting in speculators moving into the neighborhood, buying up properties, demolishing and building anew. And so they decided to do their own community rezoning plan by themselves. They invited city planning to come in and listen and to talk, but they controlled it. And the two councilmen whose districts were involved supported them. They did get some technical assistance. The Bushwick plan, I saw the final draft of the plan, which included a rezoning scheme, a scheme for rezoning, was as good as anything any city planner could produce or the city planning department could produce. It was internally consistent, it was logical, it was reasonable, and it had some modest opportunities for development, but it was geared towards preservation. And the city planning department rejected it outright. So, anyway, that's another experience. I had another experience with Chinatown in Manhattan, by the way, where community spent years developing the Chinatown uh, working group plan that included rezoning. And they spent years doing it. The city knew about it. The city actually even provided some funding to the community groups to do it. It was rejected right out by the city planning department because it didn't have enough opportunities for new development. So I could go on and on. There are other examples.
And sorry, forgive my
I'm
not
sorry.
knowing about this.
Did I
Um,
get off? Did I get off the topic?
no. This was on the topic, and so the Bush because yeah, the Bushwick plan because it's relatively close and it was relatively recent.
Sarah, other people have
was what?
questions, so give them the opportunity to ask their questions so we don't stray too far away from what Tom has said, and you'll have another opportunity for questions.
I'm sorry, but Sarah hasn't had a chance to really ask her question.
I'm sorry, Nix. She asked a question, he responded. I'd like to call on Carrie so that she might be able to answer the question. Carrie?
Hi, thanks. Yeah, I put my questions in the Q&A, but I'll just read them. So one concern I have, having grown up in California, where basically every community like has severely restricted density, and then because of that, it's completely unaffordable to live like anywhere, basically. I'm always concerned about when doing a community planning process, how do you account for the needs of people who would love to live in the neighborhood, but currently can't because it's unaffordable or there's just not enough, um, not enough units. And that goes for also people who would like to operate businesses there. So yeah, so who speaks for the people that aren't already having a foothold there? And then also you mentioned social housing, and I fully agree, like housing is a human right. We should be building lots of social housing. How do we do that given that our federal politics are a hot mess, and I'm not optimistic about the Faircloth Amendment going away anytime soon? Would just be curious to hear your thoughts on that. Thank you.
Well, yeah, everything you say is actually true. Yeah, who speaks for the people who aren't able to move in because the neighborhood's too expensive? But that's a trick by the YIMBYs. Yes, in my backyard. These are pro-development people who claim to be social activists and racial justice activists. They're mostly white, and uh, that that's a phony argument when you apply it to medium to low density neighborhoods on the periphery, like we have many of them in central Brooklyn, um, who shouldn't have responsibility for meeting the needs of middle class white folks who are claiming they need a place to live all of a sudden. And they want to go into neighborhoods they would never have walked into before. So, no, I'm sorry.
What about young people
We don't
wanting to
have
move
to
to New
take
York City?
responsibility. We don't have to take responsibility for the fact that there's no social housing. If government at all levels has a responsibility, then government has to provide housing for everybody and make sure that it's decent housing. And it also is not just housing. United Nations recognizes that housing is inseparable from the environment in which people live, the services, the schools, all of the other things that make for a quality of living life. So I don't buy this idea that, see, this is the problem with city zoning policy and housing policy is, oh, we have to meet the housing needs, vast housing needs, we have to build more housing. No, you don't. You know, we did this, I did a survey with Picture the Homeless about 10 years ago. And they came to me and said, hey, wait a minute. We think that the city already has there's enough vacant homes in the city to provide housing for every single homeless person sleeping on the streets. So we did a survey, a citywide survey. Not only did we only did 20 community districts, not the 59. And we found that we could house 5 times as many existing street homeless people with the vacancies that were found. You didn't have to build any new housing. All you had to do was recover the housing that was being warehoused and that had been abandoned or that was misused, underused, and was being held by speculators. So it's not a supply and demand problem. Our housing problem is not a supply and demand. This is not like potatoes, the potato market, you know. If there's a shortage of potatoes, the price goes up. No, this is the land market. Real estate is based on land values, and land values are based on location. So when you get a developer to come in and put new housing right next to your house, guess what happens to your house? Your land values go up, your taxes go up, and you may have to look for a new place to live pretty soon. What is that doing? That's not solving the housing problem. That's just moving it around, because new development doesn't solve the housing problem, never will. By itself, it only displaces it. And it can be part of the solution if that solution is preserving communities, strengthening communities, making the communities stronger. Yes, if there's communities have large amounts of vacant land, figure out a way to put it to use. You know, Dudley Street in Boston did one of the most successful community plans. They were surrounded by vacant lots. Why? Because the real estate folks abandoned the neighborhood as the racial composition changed. Irish moved out, blacks moved in, Caribbeans moved in, and um, a lot of landowners walked. And so what they did was they did a plan for all of those vacant lots, and it included development. But the whole idea was inclusive, including the people who were living nearby, who needed housing, and who were poorly housed. So anyway, I that's just to say I don't go for the idea that you know, development is a supply and demand problem.
And the social housing part of the question?
The social housing part,
Yeah, well, assuming the Fair Cloth Amendment stays in place, because our federal government can't get it together, uh, how can we, how can we do this? I'd love to know.
state and local governments have a lot of powers that they can use. Um, they have capital budgets that they can use. One of the most expensive housing subsidies in New York City is 421A. It's a tax break for new real estate development. Let's put let's put that money into social housing in communities where it's needed. And so the money's there. New York City budget is breaking 100 billion, right? So uh, if we were a little bit more frugal in funding outrageously inadequate services like garbage collection, uh, if the city decided to reduce waste instead of take it out, there's so many ways in which capital is available, and it's just a matter of changing our priorities. Um, the way
And which
the
communities
money,
are you gonna agree to have that new social housing? Given what you said before.
yeah, we should.
Now,
We have it. We
which
have the beginnings
communities
of it.
are going to agree to have that in their neighborhoods? That's another part of it that where I see trouble.
Yeah. Well, look, I've worked in some of those neighborhoods, you know, exclusive neighborhoods, middle income, mostly white. And when you really sit down at the table, um, and if the city has some capital and expense funds in order to pry loose some of the prejudices, you'd be surprised. how far you could go. And it's happened. It's happened in some neighborhoods. It can happen all over. The problem is political lack of courage politically. And uh, the other thing is, well, anyway.
So I just wanted to
Leave
share
it there.
with everybody, thank you so much, Tom and Kerry, because you had asked that in your first point and not an additional question. If you have more questions, then we can come around again. The order of the next few people that will be allowed to ask questions will be Greg Todd, Peter Crafts, and then Nix. Greg, go ahead.
Yeah. Can you hear me?
Yeah, hi.
Yeah, Tom, I just, you're like a breath of fresh air, I have to say.
Oh, thank
These are ideas that we've never heard before, at least and I don't know if you know much of the history, but we had this so-called M Crown proposal that's been kicking around 6 blocks of manufacturing zoning for whatever, 10 years. And I get a sense that we're like trying to outfox the fox, like we're going to outplan city planning. And they seem to be boxing us in at every turn, as the ways you described. But I think, we've got a breath of fresh air. I'm just reading the headline from the latest article, BK Reader. Councilmember Hudson blocks 2 rezonings in her district, calls for greater community collaboration. The newly elected council member says the past approach to development has contributed to unchecked gentrification. Now, you probably know she replaced Lori Kumbo.
Todd, where's your question?
So the question is, how can we support Crystal Hudson? If she wants to take a new approach, how do we do it? What can we do to support her?
Well, you probably know better than I. You know what you can do. I know that that people in the city, there are a lot of good people in city council who want to do the right thing. I notice a process though. The new council people get in, and the first thing is somebody's whispering in their ear. Well, this is how things get done. If you want something for your district, you got to play ball, and play ball with the speaker, and the speaker plays ball with the mayor. So it's tough for. I think it's a good thing that we have a better city council, a more representative city council than we've had before. But the problem is institutional, and there need to be more city council people that are willing to go out on a limb and take chances and stick up for their constituents, and don't take any elected official telling you it ain't going to happen, because that's a sign that somebody's already told them it ain't going to happen, whispered in their ear that if you want to be if you want to be reelected, it's a good idea. Oh, I totally agree with you. But if you want to be reelected, you got to be realistic. And there's too much of that around. So I think it's important that constituents have to keep pushing the elected officials, even if you've got some good, bright people who are going in the right direction and you support. Don't take anything for granted, and push them. Who was it? Was it Koch? I think was mayor saying, "Force me to do it." Well, that's a good attitude. Force me to do it, or organize so that I'll have to do it, and then the people who are whispering in my ear telling me it's the end of your political career if you do it, are going to be disappointed.
Tom, thank you. Peter Crashes, you have a question?
Well, actually, I think it just got answered. But I mean, I will maybe even, because I think this is partly what Sarah was asking at the beginning, was that, you know, we're going through a series of individual private applications along Atlantic Avenue, right where the larger plan was located, and they're occurring even though the previous council member is initiated it. You know, she put together a PowerPoint about public realm improvements, which included affordable housing and a range of other potential ideas. She put together a PowerPoint saying this is what the conversation we're going to start having, and it never happened. So I think what we're maybe what are I mean, beyond the political organizing, which is really, really great suggestion, and obviously will take a lot of work. What are some of the other kind of minefields and potholes that we're going to have to try to sidestep moving forward in terms of the process? You mentioned DCP. Obviously, it's not just up to our council member what happens. So what can we do to support her, but also what can we do to avoid the pitfalls that are moving forward, that are for sure going to be up ahead for us?
Well, I don't know enough about the particulars of your situation to be able to, to give you any details, but it sounds to me like you're asking the right questions. How do you do this? Who are your friends and allies, and who do your electeds listen to? I guess the question mark I would raise now for anywhere in Brooklyn is, you got a new borough president. I was happy to say that I testified before the Charter Revision Commission recently with him in favor of comprehensive planning as a charter revision measure. That was one of the provisions up for charter revision. And the ironic thing was we were both on this panel advocating comprehensive long-term planning, community planning, and citywide planning. And the head of the City Planning Commission basically said outright, planning is a waste of time. It's a waste of time. You produce a plan and it sits on a shelf. And that's the old myth, of course, that will kill it. But the head of the City Planning Commission. And but anyway, Reynoso and I were on the panel advocating for that charter change. City planning was against it. Reynoso's now the borough president. He does think long-term. He does think about environment. He does think about racial justice. Is he able to do it? How far will he get? Those are questions. And Reynoso is actually one of the supporters of the Bushwick plan that I was talking about, the Bushwick rezoning. So that's one place to work. And I don't think you're going to get anywheres. I don't think anything is going to change at City Hall, in the mayor's office. It looks like they're going gung-ho for development as the solution to everything. And so.
Nix?
Hello, hi. Hi, Tom. Thank you so very much for speaking tonight. You really helped me understand a lot who I'm, just a long-term tenant and community member of CB8 and activist as well. Like, as I'm not opposed to change, but I loved everything you say, because my main concern is really like that the new developments claim to have affordable apartments, but they are not truly affordable. So what you said earlier when it comes to the average earned income and the misunderstanding of people, like when developers claim like the average earned income is such and such, where the actual neighborhood's earned income is by far lower. So I've been active with Community Board 8 since 2019, but I'm still very new in understanding all the real estate terms and whatnot. So I would actually ask you if you would be willing to maybe guide like a group of, like, help people like me who are passionate and not against change, but we just want change that is really for the neighborhood. As I've been in this apartment for 20 years, I'm rent stabilized. I'm lucky, even though left and right of me, buildings are being torn down and I'm under constant noise pollution, whatnot. Doesn't matter, I'm safe, I'm rent stabilized. Is there a way that we could actually educate people who want to have a voice but don't understand the terms of these conversations? Is there a way we could help people to actually become more secure in speaking up? Because I know a lot of people who feel like they don't have a voice because they don't talk the language.
Yeah.
Is there a platform? Can we do something to actually help people to be more like safe in what they feel, as in a holistic, comprehensive neighborhood planning? Because we all understand this section of, I'm on Pacific Street in the M Crown zone. We understand that there's empty fields, a junkyard. We need development. But we don't just want 9-story, 17-story buildings like raised around us that will shake our buildings and make the small businesses left or right to us that are left to leave. We want to have a voice, but we don't know how.
Mm-hmm. Well, there are only three answers to that: organize, organize, and organize.
Oh, I'm so organizing, but
Because
I need somebody with knowledge like you who helps people understand the terms.
well, yeah, that's true. One of the things everybody can do locally is reject the way that the discourse occurs at community boards, at community meetings,
Trying to.
where somebody just shows up one day at a community board meeting and people are throwing around terms, R6 zoning. I don't know what that means, and also the whole approach of the city, and this goes from the city council, from the city agencies, right down to community boards, are stuck in this model of, quote, citizen participation,
Mm-hmm.
which is rigid and formalistic and filled with jargon, so that it's a discouragement for people to get involved. Look, if I get discouraged, I understand all the terms. I won't go to any public hearings anymore. It's a waste of time. You can take. Oh, this is assuming you have the time to take a half a day out of work or a whole day out of work to go to a public hearing and to testify for 2 minutes. People can't do. The whole system for engaging people is geared towards disengaging them.
And in
Encourage
our
them.
community board 8, it's like frustrating because they disabled the chat room where we had the capability of asking questions.
Yeah.
But it's not possible anymore. So I really don't know what to do. I want to be a part, but I just don't know how.
Well, you got to figure out a way to organize others who feel the same and
Thank,
who will change the mode of discourse.
thank you.
Not
Thank,
accept. I mean, I've seen communities do this. I've seen them kick out city employees because they were speaking a language that people didn't understand. They were using a lot of technical terms. Sure, a lot of people would just fall asleep or just walk out, but people should get angry. People need to reject that kind of treatment from any level of government.
thank
And,
you.
yeah.
Thank you.
Ethel, you have a question?
Thank you, Tom.
Ethel Tyus.
Mute myself and say I put a couple of things in the chat, but as Ms. Lemley just mentioned, there's really no chat anymore.
But we
And-
have Q&A. Everyone can see that.
Oh, good. So an easy cure is to write letters to your elected officials and share those letters with your neighbors, including the community board, and ask to read your letters at the meetings that are related to your issues. So that should be something we do regularly. 43rd AD seat election, special election was yesterday, and I read that the turnout was terrible, okay? NYCHA is funded by pilots where the feds are supposed to pay the city and the state in lieu of taxes for the properties that are in those particular states, New York in this instance. It hasn't been done. So the NYCHA housing is falling apart, and the solution that they've chosen is to sell it to private interests and privatize the parking lots and so on. I could go on, but I won't. Just write letters and call. Let our elected officials know what your positions are and vote. You've got to vote. If you don't vote, then you're not using your voice. Thank you.
Ethel. Najani.
I just want to let you all know that those of us who sound like we have everything together, we've actually been listening and reading and taking things in over a long period of time. And I was quite upset a few years ago when they asked on the back of the ballot if people were in favor of term limits for community board members. And to me, that was like serving up the city on a platter to the real estate developers because they don't have term limits.
Right.
And I know that it might be a slow process, but if you talk to other people who've been on the board a while, if you listen and you're open and you're willing to read, you'd be surprised how much you can take in. Some of us did not have any formal training, but we have sat in the room and listened to the people talk and picked up on certain things. The other thing I would suggest that you think about doing is asking this new borough president if he could possibly institute some sort of formal classes for land use and zoning so that people that are new to the community would actually have a basis for what they have to say. Keep in mind that even after you know what you want to say, it may take a while for you to be able to formulate it. So don't think that we just woke up one morning and all of a sudden we know this and we know that. It came over time.
Karen, you have a question? Karen Gray?
Yes, I'm a real estate broker, and all I'm gonna say, be very brief. This is all about the dollar. And what we have to do is get back to grassroots organizing. The chat may be gone, but we know who we are and we need to be in touch with each other. And one of the suggestions I have is to work with those people who work with you. For example, the current borough president. Get with him and have him and Mr. Agnotti involved and advise us in what we need to do. That's that.
Thank you, Karen. Jack Robinson.
Hi, I just had a follow-up about what Tom was saying about the Bushwick and Chinatown. Like when a community plans itself and DCP rejects that plan, is there any recourse for the community to go past DCP?
Well, you can take the example of the Chinatown Working Group, which is the umbrella group that sponsored the Chinatown Plan. They're still advocating for it. And now they have a new council person who is supporting the Chinatown Working Group plan. So Margaret Chin left. She was term limited, and she did not support the Chinatown Working Group plan, which just shows you how far ethnic binding carries you. The new city council person is Dominican, not Chinese.
Sarah, you have another question?
Oh, I think Jack had raised his hand before me.
I just went.
Oh, okay. Sorry, I got confused. I was wondering, well, yeah, because I was wondering about that question of how you bypass, like, so I still have lots to learn. And so from what I understand, from what you said, 197A plans can be rejected by DCP, but Chinatown Working Group has found a way to go beyond it because the political situation on the ground has changed. Okay. And I'm wondering if
Well,
you might be, pardon?
clarify something though. The Chinatown Working Group plan was a rezoning plan. See, I worked with them at the beginning, and they came to me and they said, this was 2008. We want to do a 197A plan for Chinatown because we got all of these vacant properties that are were rezoned, and we want to change that, but we also want to do many other things, make it a community plan. And I talked them out of doing a 197A plan because this was at the point where it was very clear that the city was turning up their noses at 197A plans and were just giving people a hard time. And so there was enough information already to know that that was not the place to go. And they did not do a 197A. They did a rezoning plan. They did their own rezoning plan for Chinatown. And it took years. And I'll tell you, it involved a very diverse group of people. It included people from the real estate industry. And the city planning department took 3 weeks to reject it. No discussion. That reflects an attitude. It's not just a policy. It's an attitude. It's an arrogance that's deeply embedded in too many agencies, and planning in particular.
Right. And my question, I guess, was that, I mean, it kind of sounds like you're saying that, or implying that the way that those things change are really for the political situation to change because, and I'm guessing that, you know, if the mayor appoints a head of city planning, that sort of whatever the attitude of the mayor and the new head are, they kind of trickle down throughout the agency. Or is it kind of like a, I don't want to say deep state, but is it like these lifers there who?
It's a little bit of both. You know, the political control is at City Hall. No doubt about it. The decisions get made by the commissioners, and the mayor appoints the majority of commissioners. Each borough president has one appointee. Public advocate has one appointee. But by and large, it's the mayor's. It's run by the mayor.
Right. But I mean, you did talk about the council member in the Chinatown area changing and how that affected it. And I was wondering if you could just talk about how you see member deference fitting into this
Yeah.
whole thing.
Definitely. Look what happened to the Sunset Park rezoning. The councilman, Carlos Menchaca, was able to finally kill the rezoning at the 11th hour after going back and forth and facing a lot of community opposition. In fact, there was more opposition from the community than there was support. And so, I'm sorry, my track. What was the question?
Yeah, I mean,
Oh,
you're,
we were definitely.
the Menchaca example
Okay,
is a
so
really
Menchaca,
important one.
Menchaca was being told, and all of the city council people were being told by the mayor's office that we're thinking about getting rid of this member deference thing. It's not written in the charter. It's not required. It's just been tradition. So they kept talking about how the city council leadership was talking this way too. Well, you know, it's Corey Johnson was then started talking. Well, maybe member deference isn't such a good thing, which is, you know, the councilman where in the council district where the rezoning occurs gets to call the shot and go thumbs up or thumbs down, and everybody else follows suit. They didn't want that because you could have somebody like Menchaca who really resisted being strong on this issue because almost all of the community groups, the environmental justice groups, both the Latino and Asian communities in Sunset Park opposed the rezoning of the industrial waterfront. And as it was presented, because it was a developer's deal. And they, you know, it was a very smart opposition. And so Menchaca was a surprise at the last minute. He voted against it, and then the city council followed suit, and that pretty much killed it. I mean, nobody else in the city council stood up and said, "Oh, we're not going to listen to Menchaca." So let's say we have city council deference for the time being. It's a good thing, but it does also put an awful lot of emphasis on one person, the city council person, and that's not the best thing from a community standpoint, because that person can also turn around and make a deal and then wind up telling everybody, well, this is the best deal we can get. And, you know, and basically shifting all the power to the city council person. So it's a complicated matter. It shouldn't rest on just one individual, but I think the contradictions within the city council are going to get bigger as time goes on. Term limits are a huge problem, huge problem. I've talked to a number of recent city council members, and my constant pitch to them is, you know, don't listen to them when they start whispering in your ear and saying, if you want a second term, or after your term limited out, if you want another job in politics, you got to play ball. You got to learn how to play ball. And that always means listening to the mayor or the speaker, or both.
I have to unmute myself before I say anything. So, oh, Brian, you have a question? Brian Paul, I saw you.
Hi, hello, Tom. I actually worked with Tom at Hunter.
Brian,
Geez, I can't believe how long ago it is now. 2010 and 2011.
are you on the community board now?
I'm actually not allowed to be on community boards, unfortunately. So
Yeah, that's a problem.
central staff. But I would be on board one if I was, but I can't be anyway. No, but I've been working, with the council member's office and in this area for 8 years now. Yeah, which is also longer than I thought. But just I guess one thing I would point out that's a difference between some of the examples that Tom's talked about and the Atlantic Avenue context we're looking at now is that some like the Chinatown example, the concern there is for downzoning. Really, concern is overdevelopment, a zoning that currently allows really out of context development with no affordable housing and has been like that for many years, whereas this Atlantic Avenue issue that you all have been grappling with is a zoning that basically doesn't allow any development right now. It's a kind of it's not really the same issue. It's somewhat simpler and more straightforward to have a community plan that lower, just to rein in out of control development like Chinatown has. But the issue of trying to bring in city resources and make a plan with all the city agencies involved is like kind of a harder thing to do. Just without getting the city involved, basically. It's just it's a little bit of a different problem to tackle. So I just wanted to point that out.
Right.
I don't see any hands. Tom, would you like to offer a closing to this?
Well, what haven't I said? I don't really have too much more to say, except I appreciate all of your issues and concerns and questions. They're good ones. It's good to hear people grappling with kind of some fundamental problems that are systemic, but it's also good to know that people are trying to deal with the everyday and deal with what's in front of you. And I guess my whole pitch has always been, you got to do both. You have to look for the long term and solve the short term problems at the same time. And that's what long term planning is, basically having a vision beyond just getting the rezoning or getting a new housing or getting a new community facility, but where does it fit in the larger picture? And are we serving the future generations as well as the the current population, and that's what long-term planning really forces us to do, which we don't want to do because we're all very pragmatic. We want to get things done. We want to show how realistic we are. But at the end of the day, what are our grandchildren and their grandchildren going to think when they look back and say, what on earth led them to create this mess? And in fact, my grandchildren are already at that point. Every time we talk about global warming, they remind me how much their generation actually wasn't responsible for it. And my generation and the generations preceding it contributed so much to that fundamental existential problem that we're all kind of facing, which is another thing we didn't even mention today. And I get angry every time I hear people talk about development as being the main concern. Development, what kind of development? Will it serve the next 7 generations? Will it serve the next 2 generations? And is it going to sustain human life and the life of other species on the planet, or is it can continue to lead to massive pollution and the draining of our human and natural resources? So again, I think it's really, we have to learn how to, what the Chinese say, walk on 2 legs. You gotta learn how to do both things at the same time. Think about the long-term future and plan for it, and plan for tomorrow as if the long-term future really depended on. Think about 7 Gen. I always tell my students, imagine when Henry Ford introduced the Model T, and over 100 years ago, and it was about to take over the streets. Imagine if anybody had asked the question, what's going to happen in 100 years? Oh my God, who could ever predict? Well, maybe thinking about the long-term consequences of cars monopolizing 25% of the land in our city are coming home to roost, um, and it's time to think about those long-term consequences while we're trying to take care of everyday business.
Thank you so much for the time and the information that you've imparted upon the community. We greatly appreciate all that you've offered us. And I hope this is given people that aren't as familiar with planning, as Ms. Granville said, there's several sitting around this table today, and any other day that there's a land use meeting, that when we first began our journey to understand, to make our community, or those who came to our community, more responsive to our needs, which is much of what we did. That it took a while for us to the process, but in the process, we've been able to collaborate with other people. Having diverse viewpoints in a room is never a problem. It's only a problem when you come to a standstill and do nothing. Because in the absence of us saying anything, anything can happen to us. And that, I know, was the spirit of how M Crown was being developed, knowing that there was a high opportunity for developers to come in, and we didn't want to have the same thing that happened with Atlantic Yards, where we were removed from having a voice. The community actually put forward a viable development plan, and it was out of hand rejected by the Empire State Development Corp. And what was supposed to be grassroots, someone's called it astroturf because it really wasn't grassroots voices that came to the table. So I want to thank each of you for coming to the table this evening. Tom, and I thank you so much for giving up us time, giving us your time, and I'd like to bid everyone a good evening. Thank you.
Thanks for inviting me.
Thank you so much.